Have you ever quit your job in the middle of the workday? Why? I actually did. The one and only time. I was working as a guest services manager at a hotel. The front desk and front desk employees were under my supervision. Sunday nights were notoriously slow, but I always scheduled 2 people to work the front desk because there was no security guard on duty on Sundays. One Sunday, both of my scheduled employees called in. I searched desperately for replacements, but couldn't find anyone who would work. I had pneumonia, was running a fever, and could barely talk for coughing. But it was my responsibility, so I went in to cover the desk. I was alone since I couldn't get anyone else to come in. About halfway through the shift, I was so miserable, and was getting nasty comments from guests checking in because I was working sick, that I called the general manager and begged him to come in and at least help me. He refused. One of the reservations had a note from the sales department that a fruit basket was supposed to be delivered to the room. I looked around, but no one from food and beverage had left a fruit basket. Even if I had had the basket, I couldn't have left the front desk deserted to deliver it. And honestly, I was so sick that I forgot about it later. Apparently the guest complained to the manager the next day that he didn't get his fruit basket the night before. I had called in sick that day after working the night before with pneumonia. The GM called me at home and said that I needed to come in. I asked if it could wait and he said no. So I reiterated that I had pneumonia and asked if I could come in casual clothes. He said no, that I needed to dress for work. So I got dressed in the business attire that I usually wore to work, and dragged myself in. I was called to his office the minute I got there. Now, I haven't mentioned it before, but the GM, his wife, and I were really good friends. I often stayed the night at their apartment if we were out late and I didn't want to drive home. When I went into his office, he informed me that I was being suspended without pay for 2 weeks because I had not delivered the fruit basket to the guest the night before. After working by myself the previous night, with pneumonia, getting dressed up and coming into work when I was supposed to be off, I was suspended within 2 minutes of getting there. I told him fuck you, I quit and walked out. He called me later and apologized and asked me to come back, but I refused. Yes, actually I have. I was working at a local call center about 11 or 12 years ago, and I knew that they had a strict attendance policy, and that they were not hesitant to put points on your attendance record if you were late or left early or called off. However, I did not know to what extent they would uphold that policy, and how much people were exaggerating how strict they were about it until I had been there about 6 months or so. One morning we heard a big commotion coming from the other side of the dividing wall, from the other business contract that was next to us. Well, later in the day we found out that one of the older men on the other contract had had a heart attack and had to be taken to the hospital by an ambulance. So I did not really think anything of it other than feeling bad for the guy. But a couple days later I was out back on break and I heard his supervisor talking to another employee about how she had to put half of a point on his attendance because he had to leave before his shift was over. I walked over to her and asked if I heard her correctly because I was almost certain that I had actually misheard her. But to my surprise she told me that I did hear her correctly and that she did have to put a half of a point on that employee's attendance record. Once I confirmed that I had actually heard her correctly, I went up to the front of the building to the Human Resources Department and asked the lady working in the office if what the manager had said was true. She told me that unfortunately the manager was correct and that according to the attendance policy of the employee would be pointed for leaving before his shift was over, even though it was due to a medical emergency. At that point I took my badge off of my belt loop, laid it on her desk and told her I quit. The job itself was not too bad, but after hearing that I could not bring myself to work for a company who just blatantly did not care about their employees like that. I told the boss that one of my co-workers was making sexual advances toward me and I wanted him to stop. He asked the guy who said I was making them toward him. Guess whose side he took? He called me into the office and said the guy was thinking of filing a sexual harassment suit against me. He did told me I needed to stop thinking about sex and get my workload done. My job consists of making calls to clients and scheduling meetings and business luncheons. I smiled at him and returned to my desk. I cancelled all the meetings and luncheons. I cleaned out my desk and took down all my personal pictures and my wall calendar that held the scheduled. I also took my notebook with all types of information in it. As I was walking away, the guy in question walked past me with a smirk on his face. He didn't even notice that I had packed my belongings. I stopped by the copy room and shredded all the notes and the calendar. My last stop was to HR. I asked for the exit paperwork, telling her it was my last hour there. Stunned, she gave me my paperwork, which I signed, and asked that my final paycheck be deposited in my checking account. I handed her all the office keys. I told her that I had sent all files and contacts to my former boss' email address. I left and never looked back. 3 weeks later, I was working at another job. Of course, my former boss tried to contact me. Finally, I called his boss and asked if he could stop the harassment. His boss wanted me to come back. Of course, I refused. A few months later, I found out that my former was forced to quit and the guy who harassed me was fired.